Good afternoon, everybody. Uneducated Economist here. So, have you noticed the drawdown in the amount of people who are using the repo facility out of the Federal Reserve? Now, this is pretty interesting to think about because it was quite intense. The information when it first started coming out about how the Federal Reserve was using this repo facility in order to provide liquidity to the market. It was the non-QE QE. Remember this story a few years back? But really, when you think about it, it's almost as if the Federal Reserve knew that they were going to be going into some massive money printing. Now, back in 2019, September of 2019, there was a huge corporate tax payment that had been made. And it took a lot of cash out of the big banks and sent it over to an account at the Federal Reserve called the Treasury General Account. And now when this cash payment was made from the big banks to the Treasury General Account, it left the big banks short of cash. Now, at the same time, there was a lot of government spending taking place, and the big banks like the JP Morgans, Goldman Sachs, they're like the primary dealers, so they were loaded up on treasuries and not a lot of cash at the time. And then in that night of September of 2019, there was an overnight lending rate that had shot up to like 10%. And the big banks were essentially going to freeze the next day. So now the Federal Reserve stepped up with this repo facility and said, now we'll take some of those treasuries and you can have a bunch of cash and we'll flip this at the end of the day. And we'll call it this overnight lending, right? So now what happened is that the effective fund rate, which is the interest rate that the Federal Reserve is trying to establish, that's like the basis for all loans, houses, cars, whatever. It's the effective fund rate that the Fed is attempting to move in order to establish those interest rates. Now, when we think about what it is that the when we think about what it was that the Federal Reserve was doing prior to that night in September, the Fed was working in what they called a limited reserve system. And that meant that at the end of the day, some of those big banks, the JP Morgans, Goldman Sachs, some of them would be in need of reserves and some of them would have excess reserves. The ones who had excess reserves would lend them to the ones who were in need of reserves. This overnight lending rate was essentially the effective fund rate. So now when we think about the Federal Reserve and what they are doing today, they are working in what they refer to as an ample reserve system. This means that the overnight lending rate between the big banks is not where the effective fund rate is established. The effective fund rate has been moved over to an account at the Federal Reserve called interest on excess reserves and the repo facility. Between these two accounts, they can channel the effective fund rate, and this is essentially what the Federal Reserve has been operating in for the past few years. Now, if we go and we look at the repo facility, and the drawdown in the amount of people who are actually using this facility, we're finding that it is half of what it peaked out at. I'll leave a link down in the description to that article. And so when I think about if this continues, if this drawdown in the amount of use of this repo facility, eventually it will run into a position in which that the repo facility is no longer needed at all. And that would lead me to believe that we would be moving from an ample reserve system back into a limited reserve system, in which that the big banks will then be establishing the effective fund rate from the overnight lending rate between them. Now, I'm not trying to say that that's what's actually going to happen here, but it certainly leads to me to believe that could happen if this was to continue, this drawdown in the amount of use coming out of the repo facility. So we think about it like how it is that the Federal Reserve attempts to establish interest rates. It has been moved just recently to these two facilities, the repo facility and the interest on excess reserves. But ultimately, if the quantitative tightening continues, which it seems to be, and that they promise to keep the interest rates elevated for a significant amount of time, then what we will find is that the ample reserves will turn into a limited reserves, and the Federal Reserve will have moved the effective fund rate back over to the big banks, in which that the overnight lending rate will then be what it is that is used to establish the interest rates for all loans. Does this kind of make sense? I see a lot of people talking as if this repo facility is a major deal. Now, it is a major deal for providing liquidity or even drawing liquidity out. I mean, there was, the same problem when there was too much liquidity out there and too much cash and nobody had a place to put it. They found that the repo facility was an excellent spot that they could go and gain a little bit of interest off of their cash. Money market accounts love this, right? See, the Federal Reserve had established this idea long before COVID. Long before any of this stuff. In fact, it started back in September of 2019 with that huge corporate tax payment that had been made. And now I had done a video even before that, I think 6 months, a year or so, before that, called Things Are Changing, where I knew that the Federal Reserve was wanting to use this repo facility. Now, at the time, we were still operating in a limited reserve system, so it didn't make a lot of sense on why it is that they were chatting so much about this repo facility unless they knew that there was going to be issues coming into the future in which that they would need it. And man, did those issues not come. See, this is where, I don't feel the Federal Reserve is taken by surprise. People say, the Federal Reserve has no idea what they're doing. They've lost control. They have, no plan and everything is just, flying by the seat of their pants. I don't believe that at all. I mean, they had talked about this repo facility long before anybody was even mentioning the ample reserve system or abundant reserve system. We were still operating in a limited reserve system. But the Fed knew that the issues were coming, that the need for liquidity or the need for the money printer was going to be established at some point in the future, and that repo facility was a necessity to have. And they set it up, and they got it, and it totally worked. So this is where I really feel like once we see the repo facility begin to shut down or just lose use altogether, we will know that we were moving back into a limited reserve system in which that those interest rates will be established back at the big banks again. Now, whether or not that's a big deal for monetary policy or interest rate setting policies, it's more important to understand what it is that is happening and why it's happening than it is necessarily that the Federal Reserve is moving their interest rate setting policies. I mean, is it really a big deal whether it's established at the repo facility or if it's established between the big banks? I don't think it really is a big deal. I mean, to a lot of people it might be. But to me, that's just another form of the Federal Reserve using their monetary policy tools in a way that not a lot of people are anticipating. Again, did they really lose control when they knew exactly what this facility was going to provide for them? And they knew it years ago? I mean, if the Uneducated Economist can make a video about it, then it shouldn't be a surprise, right? Uneducated Economist, you guys let me know.